Welcome to NewYorkBIOs Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020 bringing you fireside chats with leaders across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Peter Alff, Senior Venture Partner at Orange Grove Bio.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hawks-Bland, and I'm the CEO at NewYorkBIO. We are excited that you're joining us for another edition of our virtual breakfast. A special thank you to Cooley for being our sponsor for this month's series of breakfast. This will wrap up their month-long sponsorship, so we very much appreciate the partnership. This morning, we have Peter Alff joining us today from Orange Grove Bio. He has a very rich and incredible background, scrolling through academia, industry. And so we're really going to get to dig in with him. You may notice we're missing one of our three. Normally you have three heads in front of you. So Jarek is on vacation this week, so we are missing him, but we will soldier on. Peter and I are ready. A couple of housekeeping things. I know that you will have questions as we go through our discussion with Peter this morning. So please put those in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll get to those as we go through the conversation. And one more housekeeping thing, and I'm going to actually put it in the chat for everyone. So the NewYorkBIO annual meeting is September 27th, and the registration for that is now live on our website. So I've put that link in for everyone. This is not the last time you'll be hearing that, of course. So we hope that you will register early and often if you want, but we definitely hope we'll see you on September 27th. So with that, good morning, Peter. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Jennifer. Good to see you.
So as you know, for the most part, we roll back the clock on this conversation, and we talk about what is our favorite sort of origin story. So part of the beauty of having a robust ecosystem in New York and people that have been around and have done lots of different things in the ecosystem is that we get to benefit from the advantage of what you've learned over your career. So talk to us about, let's wind it back to Rockefeller for you, and let's talk about how you got started in the industry in New York and sort of what roles you've had, and then we'll dig in individually to some of your things.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you again for the invite to speak here today. This is great. So yeah, I really had a very conventional academic career for a number of years, did a PhD, and then to bring us to Rockefeller, that's where I did a postdoc starting in about 2007. So at this point in time, I really was already curious about the biotech industry, about what options might be out there. So I kind of was already putting some feelers out. I'll make a very long story short. I met Chris Marshall, founder of Calder Biosciences, at Rockefeller. And through a series of conversations, we came up with some ideas around how to potentially apply the technology he had developed to vaccine immunogens. I left the postdoc. The two of us basically created that version of Calder Biosciences, which was at the time called Avatar Biotechnologies, and got started. So it was really a true stomp it out of the ground sort of biotech startup situation. Really very little pre-existing data, very little to start with, just Chris's ideas, my work at the bench, and trying to make something happen.
Big switch from sort of Rockefeller, right, and the sort of resources that are inherently available to you at an academic institution, especially like Rockefeller.
Absolutely. So, one of the lessons I think I learned during that, and I should give Chris a ton of credit for it, is really how to think. It's a little bit cliche, but outside of the box about getting a company started. We had a pretty non-traditional starting point for a company there. You're mentioning that, yeah, it's true. We had no equipment. We had no pre-existing data at the time. We had no grant funding or really any support except this initial investment that we got from the Gates Foundation, which was, quite small, a few $100,000. But what we did do is strike up a partnership. We collaborated with the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative in order to align our interests in terms of what we would bring and what they would bring for HIV vaccine development. And what this did is sort of overnight give us access to that huge state-of-the-art lab facility. So through aligning interests, we accessed, millions of dollars of equipment and resources and connections more or less overnight.
Was it difficult to sort of figure out that path, or was it literally like you have X or Y options and to continue the research and you
Yeah,
see what was out there?
I think it was really just having a completely open mind about the possibilities, not creating any sort of limitations on what was possible with partnering and with the resources available. And just again, trying to align interests, trying to find, what we need to achieve, what someone else might be able to bring to the table to help us achieve those goals, and then figure out what configuration of aligned interests and collaborative work would get us there.
Right. And you did. And I put in the I put in the link for everyone if they missed it, Chris's VBS talk on our YouTube channel. So folks can go back and dig in to his view of of your shared journey with Calder. So okay, so Calder, IAVI, what was next?
So for me, from a career trajectory, and I don't want to make this all about sort of my journey exclusively, but I left Calder after about a little over 6 years with the company, as we grew from just Chris and I to a much bigger team, a lot more financial resources, a much larger operation, to basically take a position with the Office of Therapeutics Alliances at NYU Langone here in New York. That, for me, that was driven largely by wanting more transactional business experience and wanted to get a little bit of a deeper understanding of licensing and startup formation from different perspectives. And again, so there's a long backstory to it, but the position sort of fell in my lap, and it felt like the right move at that time for me.
So because at Calder, you had a lot of grants, right? So that was a different type of funding, different type of transaction experience. What was so interesting? What different parts, right, of what you could do at NYU made that more attractive at that time?
Good question. To me, I had started to see, I'd started to have a little bit of frustration with the non-dilutive funding process alone. Calder relied very heavily on that mechanism, and that makes a lot of sense when you're developing vaccines, especially in the pre-COVID era when vaccines were not quite as commercially attractive as they are today.
Right.
So I wanted to see how you could basically accelerate development by having different resources at hand. At NYU, one of the big selling points for that whole operation that Nadim Shodi and Bob Schneider put together there was having a relatively large pool of capital from NYU Langone available to immediately deploy towards programs de-risking therapeutics assets within the university. So not having to sort of put together a proposal, go through a funding cycle, and then get to work, being able to immediately de-risk an asset and move forward was attractive.
Talk to us about that process, because I know that the work was, I think I would call it ahead of its time, right? Maybe when OTA was started.
Yeah, I think so. And it's definitely has a continuing effect on my thought process about the role of universities, the role of tech transfer in basically in innovation and creating new medicines. The idea was really to break free from the constraints that typically are with a university it was basically a way to run little biotech companies within the context of NYU. That was the sort of like founding concept. And then, it really highlighted the sort of central role that universities, if they do it correctly, can play in accelerating therapeutics development. The historical tech transfer process, as I think you're well aware, is a bit more passive, sort of taking in invention disclosures, understanding what IP the university would basically have assigned to it as a result of Bayh-Dole, and then figuring out if there's anybody that would want to license that. It's sort of like passively kind of walking around trying to figure out who would want to take a license. Taking a more proactive approach to not just transacting through a license agreement on that IP, but also sort of taking on some of the risk and the burden yourself to take the product related to that IP to a more mature stage of development. Was key to OTA. I think they're one of the first groups, if not the first group in the US to do this. And then I think it applies across the board. I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned for really early stage biotech companies there, and other universities.
And NYU had we'll call it the beauty, the advantage, right, of some significant capital generated by the licensing agreements that it had. Remicade, and I feel like there was a couple more maybe.
Stutent was another one, right. But Remicade was by far the lion's share of that, licensing revenue that was pouring in.
That gave them the ability to sort of try new things, right, and see how that could.
I mean, yes and no. I think the success of Remicade in particular within NYU, it's not so much that there was basically a few $100 million in licensing revenue coming in every year on that drug. It was more having an example of success that impacts kind of the culture and the understanding at the the highest levels of the administration, to see that the tech transfer operation and sort of investing in investing in your own scientists could result in something that is financially beneficial as well as addresses an unmet medical need. So it's more the psychological aspect of having that big success than it is the cash that enabled something like OTA to be born there.
And then what were some of as you were there, and how long were you at OTA?
I was only there a couple of years, I think 2 years.
So what were the things that you saw as far as the evolution of how OTA approached sort of, the build out, right, of NYU's IP?
Yeah, so in terms of like finding opportunities, I think one of the things that OTA does or did that there's a lesson for tech transfer in general on, although I think many groups know this, is not relying on those invention disclosures and that IP as the foundation. At OTA, I mean, we were talking to faculty, well before they were imparting invention disclosures and engaging with the tech transfer office around, patenting discussions. It was more about the science, more about what the kind of innovation was and how that could be applied to a drug development program. And we would invest internally in programs, even without there being any underpinning IP at that time, with the sort of view towards the IP will come, we'll roll that in as necessary, but we really want to focus on asking key questions that relate to a thesis we had that we developed ourselves around drug development. So a lot of back and forth, a lot of kind of ideation with the professors there.
So actually, this might be a good place. So we've had a question. Speaking of IP, we've had a question from the audience about IP strategy mistakes. And as you think ahead, like obviously you had to deal with the IP, right? And the question for everyone is sort of the common or biggest IP strategy mistakes and then a series of sort of those in the ecosystem, right? Sort of investors, VC, angel, companies, sort of the founder, board of directors, or universities tech transfer. How do you think, I'm going to sort of synthesize it, how do you think about IP and how should those different pieces of the ecosystem think about it?
Yeah, so I think it's important to think about what type of product you're developing. I'm going to keep my comments limited to drugs, to therapeutics development.
Yeah.
And I think, some of the common mistakes really, there's obvious ones like just disclosing things and creating prior art as an academic that you might not want to do. I think the biggest sort of strategic mistake people make, though, is thinking that they have the key sort of like final claims in hand around, let's say, composition of matter for a high value therapeutic at a very early stage based on that first filing. I don't want to say that initial filing is not critical to the whole structure of your IP
It's an underpinning.
defense, but it's an underpinning.
Yeah.
And I think there's kind of a lack of realization around kind of what the final claim that's going to protect your final product looks like. And then that sometimes impacts your decisions around how fast you need to go with regard to either raising funds or doing X, Y, and Z because you think you're losing patent life. Sometimes it makes people feel that there's sort of an inflated value to the IP package alone, which can impact negotiations in a negative way. So those are a couple strategic pitfalls, I would say, that it's good to be aware of. But yeah.
And so timing is important in
Certainly.
that, as well as the whole discovery process.
Absolutely. I think timing and just really understanding what you have, obviously working with your IP attorneys, experts in the field, your potential partners, in particular in pharma, if that's where you're ultimately trying to push a drug to, that's very important.
Yeah, and having worked at the federal level on patent reform when I was inside pharma, a couple of different large pharma organizations, I can tell you that it's something that down the road the pharma companies are going to think very much not only a lot about, but also from a policy perspective, right? So like the thread runs through a longer piece of the development than even sometimes it's hard to think about when you're very, very early in the process.
Yeah, I guess maybe to sort of be concise, overthinking and over rotating on like the value of like one particular patent is not necessarily the best way forward if you're an entrepreneur or if you're an academic that's looking to form a company. Understand that there will be a lot more to come. Right.
So let's also step back and think about when you were at OTA. So one of I think the things that is interesting about that is not only the sort of the internal work you were able to do and the de-risking, but also you worked with external sort of service providers, right, to do this. You weren't doing all of this internally at NYU with NYU, teams and resources and running experiments. Talk to us about that aspect and how you set that up.
Yeah, so we were doing very little, if any, work internal at NYU. One of the core principles of the whole operation was to externalize that work. The idea being we can control how the experiments are designed, how they're executed, but also get some third-party validation on key findings that had been discovered within the university. So, that's very valuable for investors, for potential commercial partners. That validation of a particular singular academic finding from one lab goes a long way towards creating confidence and conviction around an opportunity. So we did that quite a bit. Only if it was essential that an experiment be done within the university would it be done there.
Right. What would be an example of an essential one to do in-house?
I think a very common one is when there's a particular disease model, usually like a mouse model that has been generated at the university. The mouse hasn't been widely distributed. That model is up and running and exists within the university. Then some of those in vivo experiments using that model will be done at the university. And that would apply for a complex in vitro system, maybe an analytical technique of really sophisticated mass spec analysis, for example, where there's very specialized expertise that really only exists within the university.
Right. And then you have then you have not only the people, right, but the tools to do what you would be spending externally to do anyway. So it makes a lot of sense
Yeah, exactly.
from a finance perspective. Talk to us about how you thought about using sort of CROs, right?
Mhm.
And then what you did that change over the course of the work with them?
I would say, during my time at OTA, it certainly evolved. And then this has been something that, at least from my perspective, has been evolving for the last decade. That's from my perspective, but also the way CROs think about engaging with early research. So, I think when we started out, we were just looking for sort of like, who can do X, Y, and Z experiment, and there wasn't that much depth of thought to it, other than maybe pricing. As OTA grew, we started thinking more about like risk sharing. We often had a view towards forming a startup as the product of an OTA effort.
Yes.
And if there was a CRO willing to, for example, not just run these experiments, but participate in take some equity in the new startup in exchange for services in the short term, we would entertain those deals. And that's a very common structure that's grown and utilized, by much bigger companies even today. So that's one thing we would look for. We would also look for communication. We would often take, proposals from various communications and from various CROs and just see how the communication was. Was there responsiveness to particular scientific questions, technical questions? Were you going to get the most value for your money scientifically? Were they bringing something to the table that wasn't just execution? Were they a thought partner in the program to some extent, especially with the development of things like high throughput screening assays, assay development? Really important to have somebody that is a thought partner in the process as well. So we would look on those dimensions for CROs as well.
So what aren't they good at? What did you have to be careful about? Sort of not this is a trite phrase, right? Like overpromise, underdeliver, but like what and then also what do small companies that are considering working with CROs at very early stages in their companies, what do they need to be thinking about and looking out for?
Yeah. Okay. Two things. One, and this I think applies to science across the board, timelines are going to slip. So you have to discount the timeline in those proposals for sure. And you have to understand that it's a different context in many cases than an academic lab. A lot of the people doing the execution work aren't really, they're not invested in the output the way you are, and they're not necessarily as expert in the field as you are. So you have to really be looking at the output of the work as regularly as possible to bring your expertise in the field to bear on the data that's being produced. I think it's really important to not view it as an engagement where you just sign a contract and get data at the end. That's sort of like the ideal scenario. But
Right.
really, it's an ongoing research collaboration that you have to stay on top of. And if you can find an individual, as I mentioned before, who can be a real thought partner, understand what the objective is, communicate back and forth effectively with you about that, and have that person influence the execution work on your behalf, that's really, really valuable.
And then what's a good example of a time was there ever a time that you thought you should use a CRO in that process, and then in retrospect you wished you had done it in-house, or vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, there've definitely been a handful of times where, and this is not just at OTA, at later engagements as well, where the idea was, well, we'll just pay X dollars to offload these activities from an academic lab who had already demonstrated that, for example, they could run a particular assay, but it just wasn't optimal to sort of scale up doing those experiments within a university, because then you're using postdocs, grad students for experiments that aren't necessarily central to them graduating or moving on in their careers. So it's like, well, let's just move this whole module outside. And then that transfer process, and ultimately getting the assay up and running, let's say to equal standards as was happening in the university, just eats up a lot of time, and it would have been easier just to keep it there, maybe keep it at a smaller scale, and just get the data that way.
Yeah.
I don't
And
want to
sometimes
like
you
go
don't
through
know-
name particular CROs or anything. but-
Yeah, no. I wouldn't want you to. But I think that sometimes you don't know sort of until it's done, right? Like everyone goes in with good intentions, and everyone is planning on the best out and most efficient outcome, right? But that doesn't always,
Yeah.
that's not always what happens. So talk to us about moving on. So you moved on, right, from NYU.
Yes, so I left NYU to join Kairos Ventures in, I think that was 2016. Yeah, and that was a big transition just for me from a career standpoint. I was immediately given a huge amount of responsibility, essentially, driving all of our seed, Series A, life science investments on the eastern half of the US and in Europe, as well as operating several of the portfolio companies as interim CEO. So huge change, both from an operational standpoint and sort of a capital allocation decision-making standpoint.
What was the first thing that you learned? Like, what was your first takeaway from shifting fully sort of into the finance and company growth space?
At least in my personal experience, I think one of the things that was immediately apparent was, I think coming from like an entrepreneur's perspective and the university perspective, there's a thought process that you go into. If you were to get a look behind the curtain in a venture capital firm, there'd be this extremely sophisticated operation going on in terms of how decisions are made based in terms of financial upside. Technical due diligence would be extremely intense, and that was not necessarily my experience. I was sort of felt like decisions were made to a large extent, in a similar fashion to the way we were making them at NYU. We're looking at the opportunity, we're making kind of reasoned decisions of what's going to have the highest potential, and then moving forward. So that was one thing that was a little bit surprising. I guess it shouldn't have been, but
yes.
But then separately, the challenge of going back and forth from the operator's perspective, the company's perspective, and the investor's perspective, seeing like where those two can start to diverge in terms of the needs of the investor and the needs of the company. And having a foot in both of those worlds was a very, very interesting learning experience to kind of see where those tensions first start to arise.
So talk to us a little bit about that. Let's spend a little bit of time on that. So talk to us about being fully on the venture side. So that foot, how is that different? How did you think differently about a potential investment than you did at, say, OTA about capitalizing sort of a discovery?
Yeah, there was a lot of overlap, to be perfectly honest, because the objective of NYU in the context of OTA is very similar to a seed stage investor making an early investment. So, is there real white space? Is there an unmet need that this technology is uniquely solving? What are the costs to get to sort of a general proof of concept that you've solved this problem? And then, how do you ultimately realize that value, both in terms of addressing the medical need as well as financially through some sort of commercialization approach, either just an M&A transaction, selling the company to a larger party, or potentially taking the company public, or out licensing some aspect of the technology. I'd say if there's a distinction on the venture side, you're paying more attention to that latter piece, to how do we like what is the exit opportunity, and not just hand waving around what is, our exit, but
Yeah.
trying to get extremely granular as best you can about where that's going to come from, the timeline to that event, the sort of probability of that event happening in a given period of time, and the cost associated with getting there. And yeah, there is more focus on that aspect of it, for better or worse.
Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, too, you have to redeploy capital, right? I mean, that's the goal.
Yes.
And then okay, so now put your other foot, right? You said your foot in one bag. So I'm continuing with your analogy. So take your other foot, right? The foot that was in the company building space, basically sort of the entrepreneur space,
Mhm.
and talk to us about how you thought about it there. Because you're
Yeah.
right. And then I want you to talk to us about, you talked about the delta or the divergence, right? And sort of
Mhm.
the mindset. Talk to us about that.
So yeah, from the company standpoint, um, you want to, you have a much more real-time look at what's happening with the data itself, the science itself. And in many cases, you start to realize, I think more quickly than investors often do, where, as they would say, like where the puck is headed. So what that might mean is you might have a better view into how to pivot the business, make a change in strategy in terms of the product development, leaning into one aspect of your business versus another, and then explaining that to the investors that may have invested in you on a particular thesis that may now be distinct from this pivot that you see and are in a better position to see than the VC might be, is a challenge. That's a place where I think the managers of the company really are going to have a better understanding of where to take the business. Because to sort of sell an investor on a whole new thesis, you have to go back through all those thought processes I just mentioned. Okay, so how does that impact our exit opportunity? How does that impact the timelines? Is that going to mean we have to invest more, or does it mean we might need to invest less, which is sometimes not a good thing, this sort of thought process.
Were there scenarios like you're talking about where Kairos, actually, let me ask this back the other way. So when you had a scenario like that, right, and the company, we needed to pivot, what were some examples of the way that Kairos would respond, right? Did you have a situation where Kairos would pull out and then the company existed with existing investors or new investors based on the pivot? I'm not looking for company names, but just examples, right?
Sure. I mean, there certainly were numerous examples of this in various forms where either, the investor, in this case Kairos, would choose to not continue to participate in the financing of the company based on new information or changes in strategy. Certainly, there are times where it was more of a hybrid, where I would be personally in the position of sort of bridging a gap, kind of explaining to the investment side, why it makes sense that we do a certain pivot, explaining back to the founders of the company why it's important from the investment perspective that X, Y, and Z happen, and then potentially coming up with a new strategy that basically makes everybody happy. So there's a couple examples of that. Or
right.
Nobody happy, but it's viable for going forward. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think when it's a difficult situation to solve, and when, for example, the investor is likely to pull out, and this is just, I think, perhaps an obvious statement about this field, is when there's a huge disconnect between the founder, especially a founder that retains control of
Right.
the business, and the investor.
Yeah.
That's where you have a lot of friction that emerges quickly.
Yeah. And then conversely, right? Like, and maybe you have names for this example, right? But an example of where a company made a pivot, Kairos stayed, right, and helped the company continue to grow.
Yeah, I mean, I think some good examples in terms of this within the Kairos portfolio, companies like Foldax and Providi both made some important strategic decisions early on that continued to they were a little bit different than the original thesis, but the company's grown very successfully, and Kairos continued to participate as a result. I think this is where founder, the CEO, plays a big role in maintaining confidence. I mean, this is a little bit of a human component to this.
Yeah.
You can, as a founder, this is why certain types of founders, I think, are can be more successful than others in keeping businesses alive. If you can pivot the business and continue to generate enthusiasm from your investor base, just through the personal relationships you have, through your demonstrated conviction in this new direction, that really helps the business. If you're kind of being a little bit standoffish, but still demanding strategic changes and not communicating as much and don't have as robust a relationship with your investor base, then it can be problematic in terms of continuing to get funding from those original sources. So I think it's definitely important to think about investor relations and how to maintain, usually either through the board or just directly through relationships with the principals. Maintain those personal relationships and lines of communication. Silence and lack of information about what's happening in a company is probably one of the things that makes investors the most nervous. It's very kind of unnerving when if you're in the investor role, you're trying to communicate with the CEO, you're not getting responses back, you don't know what's happening, you're not sure exactly where the business is going. That can be problematic and make you lose confidence.
It can be problematic, and I think that's good advice in lots of areas, not just early stage life science companies, right?
Yeah, this is just like basic human psychology, I guess.
Which is good. It's good to be reminded of that sometimes, because I do think, I mean, like, all joking aside, like, especially in that, like, scientific founders / CEOs tend to get head down, right? And just, sort of, they forget sometimes. It's easy to forget all of the stakeholders need to continue to have that sort of same level of engagement, right, in the success. It evolves over time, but you're right. But communication and information is a consistent for success.
Yeah,
I think that's a fantastic thought. So let's keep moving, because I want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk about Orange Grove. You did go to and I never get this name right. Is it Oaken?
Yeah, it's Oaken. It's
Oaken.
I know. It's an anagram. It's an anagram for I know.
Oh, okay. Now I know. Great. So talk to us a little bit about there, and what you see sort of generally, right, from the AI perspective, and how you've seen that now as AI has continued to not only be sort of the buzz term, but actually to see some of the development across the industry.
Yeah, and I should say this is not my deepest area of expertise. Nonetheless, I think I'd been curious for a long time about the role that AI could play in healthcare, and that was what led me to Alcon in the first place, to sort of understand if there was a real sort of secret power resident in these technologies to really accelerate drug development and healthcare. And my experience, my current belief, maybe up until very recently, is that there is a lot of potential, especially when you've got really high quality data, well curated data, and you can parse through basically accelerate precision medicine, figure out which patients are going to respond best to which therapy, which ones might not, and take a more precision approach to medicine and guide therapy and create better outcomes that way. That's clearly a place where these types of predictive algorithms based on multimodal data would come into play. In terms of the drug discovery and development stages, I don't think there's been as much in that realm yet, except for maybe now with some of these generative AI approaches. Who knows? Maybe we're turning a corner in terms of in designing new therapies from scratch, really being able to understand toxicity and pharmacokinetics, in silico. That would be amazing if that really comes through. I think we're in the infancy of that aspect of AI in healthcare now.
What about, and then what do you think about patient? Because obviously Oken, right, deals a lot with, right, the sort of patient data as much as my review of the website in advance of my conversation with you tells me. Talk a little bit. We haven't talked really about patient data or patients, right? Yet in the conversation. How do you think as an investor about and a company builder about working with patient groups, patient funder groups, right? Talk to me about how that has woven in, if it has, into how you think about drug discovery.
Yeah, I mean, from the Orange Grove perspective, which we'll get to, it plays a huge role. We work very closely with patient advocacy groups. I think there are, on the sort of like digital, the AI and healthcare side of things, the access to that data, to patient data, is a complex, very complex transaction. You have a lot of HIPAA regulations you need to deal with. The data security considerations are really high compared to just the licensing of a patent portfolio or something. So one of the things to really keep in mind if you're involved in that area is the need to bring in many more stakeholders buy-in into access to that type of human data than you would for other types of university IP. So really figuring out all the different players that have a stake in what happens with that human data is important. In a way, it's not for other tech transfer type operations. On the advocacy, like patient advocacy groups, there's a lot more interest recently by FDA in terms of hearing from patients and patient stories and what their kind of needs are for new therapies. So this is something that is frequently now incorporated into regulatory filings, and disease foundations have a really, I think, rich understanding of the diversity of patient populations, how people are actually treated conventionally, in many cases, how they're suffering from various diseases. So there's a lot to learn about the problem you're trying to solve by engaging with those foundations, especially those that are really mature. Groups like the CF Foundation, Crohn's and Colitis Foundation have really excellent operations.
Right. And we've also seen that even some of the sort of patient advocacy disease organizations are even the NDA holder now, right, on some therapeutics.
Yeah.
So it's I think the model, if you will call it that, right, has evolved over time, in large part through necessity of trying to get treatments to market, right, for the patients that they
absolutely.
That they serve. So let's kind of switch to Orange Grove. And we saved the best for last and the current for last. Talk to us about why Orange Grove, right? And we had Mark on, I think it was really right about 2 years ago. And so talk to us about why Orange Grove for you and what you see as sort of the benefit of that model of venture work.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, Orange Grove is really the optimal situation. I remember talking to Mark years ago when he was just starting Orange Grove, as he was, I think, doing a really good job talking to everybody who had some perspective on the space, figuring out what was working, what wasn't, synthesizing all of that into not just the right approach, but the right kind of legal structure and financing structure to actually effectuate early stage company formation out of universities as best as possible. I think taking lessons from all the early venture groups that were doing something's right, something's not. So for me, combining a real focus on academic science, kind of needing to take on a very venture capital type perspective with how you're allocating capital and what the returns on that capital allocation might look like, as well as operating small businesses through external R&D with contract research organizations, et cetera, as well as just building a whole web of alliances. It really makes perfect sense for me. It's fantastic. I think, to be concise, the model at Orange Grove has evolved quite a bit over the last couple years. I mean, obviously grown significantly. We have, I think, we have probably 50 full-time employees now, and a whole host of really great contractors and exceptional advisors. So we have a large team that's grown rapidly, to Mark's credit. But having the flexibility of a holding company model, as opposed to raising the funds we have through a venture firm structure, is critical. And I think Mark was very smart to identify this early on as the right way to approach early stage company development.
So talk to us about that, right? Like, so describe that model, right? And
yeah, the reason being, at its core is because, the capital we raise, we have great flexibility with. And one of the key risks for an early stage company is the team and the science. And what happens, okay, you find great university early stage program, comes out of OTA, for example. What do you do now? The typical situation is sort of an entrepreneur gets involved, you cobble together a team of consultants and just try to move forward a therapeutics program, which sometimes can work, but is very inefficient and very high risk. And especially in the geographies that Orange Grove is really focused on, which is basically everywhere outside of Boston and San Francisco, you don't have a huge base of experienced operators to draw from. So how does this relate to the holding company versus venture fund? So with the holding company, we can hire a lot more people. It's why we have the team we have. We can use our funds either for direct investments or for investment, and just have that flexibility. Whereas with a venture fund, and when you're working on a 2% management fee, you can't really hire the type of operations team that we have at Orange Grove to immediately deploy into a new company and very professionally develop an asset.
Right. You need them spread more broadly. You need the human capital to doing multiple pieces.
We needed to build a biotech team that can actually operate numerous drug development programs in parallel, and do that with the understanding that this team is going to work together across multiple different programs under the umbrella of Orange Grove.
Right. And so what we talked to Mark, right, about sort of his ideas around founding, but why then, and why did you choose to join Orange Grove when you did? What was the most intriguing piece?
Yeah, so the most intriguing piece was, so at Kairos, which did a really good job at identifying university technologies and committing to venture creation, but there was a gap, which was that operational component. It was up to me, let's say, as the CEO of this newly formed company. We might have millions of dollars in the bank, but to find the right people to then execute on that program, right, it took a lot of time. So being able to do something very similar, but from day one, have a whole team of really seasoned drug developers available to move something forward was very attractive to me. Also, the focus on New York and other underserved geographies, again, just not Boston and San Francisco, was very attractive to me. And yeah, just sort of combining all the different skill sets I developed over the last 13, 14 years.
So talk to us a little bit about that. So you've said a couple of times sort of the non, as I like to say, that those who will not be named, no, the non-New York, but you really do. Orange Grove has a focus on areas, right, of collaboration with universities that may not be sort of the first stop for a lot of funders. So talk to us about not only that idea, but how Orange Grove has been executing on that, because I think y'all have been doing a pretty amazing job.
Yeah, I mean, just full commitment to to building relationships in a sustained way at centers of excellence in these parts of the countries. I mean, we intentionally set up our headquarters in Cincinnati, Ohio, to sort of signal that commitment to the central part of the country. You know, we could have set up in New York, we could have set up in Boston, whatever.
Yeah.
But moved to Cincinnati intentionally, hire about half the team in Cincinnati intentionally, and really just it's through sustained presence, understanding the kind of politics and the stakeholders with these institutions, the way other groups might be doing in Boston or San Francisco, and just committing to it. You know, it's not something you can do overnight. It requires kind of always showing up and looking at technologies, giving feedback, building relationships, and just kind of growing organically. I don't think there's a secret sauce to it. It's just an actual commitment as opposed to a you know, lip service to the idea.
Yeah. So we had a question from the audience. It says there's so many models, right? Which is true. It says, how does a holding company model work with a hybrid research model? So
with a hybrid research model, I guess I'm not sure what a hybrid research model is, but I'll describe the way Orange Grove operates at a high level. I mean, we have the holding company, which employs the team I described. When we want to start a new company based on university technology, we'll form a brand new legal entity, which will be a subsidiary of that holding company. That is the entity into which the IP is licensed. That's the entity that will hold the contracts with contract research organizations that will be responsible for executing the work. That's pretty much the way this occurs. So ultimately, let's say that company develops the asset, is successful. It's a standalone company in and of itself with different investors, different stakeholders. I mean, Orange Grove will be syndicating investment in that company with other investors, the way we have, in the past. And it just has its own life cycle, distinct from the holding company.
So so let's go back to patients for a minute, because I think that, right, Orange Grove does a podcast, right, with patients.
Yes.
Is that right? Talk to us a little bit about that, and I'll try to link to it. If my tech, I don't have Derek to do our technical work today, so I'll link to the podcast page too.
Yeah, I mean, and the idea behind the podcast is just to kind of continuously ground the company in the patient's perspective and what the real unmet medical needs are, and not sort of view everything purely from a financial perspective. It's very easy to get detached and kind of go high level, thinking about the economics of the situation, thinking about the nitty gritty of a drug development program, and lose sight of why it's all being done. So the podcast is one of a number of things that we do to sort of keep the company close to the problem that we're trying to solve. And our connection with the disease foundations that I mentioned is another such way.
So we in NewYorkBIOs, so I think most of those probably know, we do a patient engagement summit each year. I think this we did it in April this year, and this next one will be our fourth one. And they've only grown each year as we found more and more patient organizations, right, with whom to work. And we obviously, from our standpoint, work closely with them on policy issues, right? So in Albany, right, with the New York legislature, or in DC at the federal level. So we found it's incredibly important to collaborate with the patients. And frankly, it's really enriched what we're able to do as far as helping work within the ecosystem. So thank you for the work, right, that you're doing at Orange Grove. I think it's really an important component.
Thank you.
So we only have 5 minutes left. So what do you see? A couple of last questions. One is, what do you see as sort of the new trends and coming out of academia that you are excited about working on through your work at Orange Grove?
Yeah, so we're focused very much on autoimmune disease right now. This is driven by a number of different factors. One, we have a real orientation towards immunology in general, just throughout the team. Two, There's so much work being done, sort of breakthroughs in understanding the immune system that are happening at the university level right now, that's where a lot of the innovation that's being funded by NIH seems to be developing from. Three large pharma companies who we work very closely with now, which is a new evolution really for Orange Grove over the last, let's say, 18 months. We've partnered with a number of the large pharma companies to basically bridge from academic work to their early development pipelines. And there's a very robust interest in therapies addressing autoimmune indications by pharma. So that's really what I'm looking at and focused on and excited about right now.
And so when you're also excited, let's talk about, it's not New York Bios virtual breakfast without talking about the New York ecosystem. So you should be prepared for this because you've joined us on some of our other episodes. Talk to us about sort of your thoughts on the ecosystem in New York and what you see and what you'd like to see over the next several years.
No, I think I remain bullish on the New York ecosystem and biotech, obviously. I think it's really great to see what I view as a recovery following COVID happening right now. For a long time, as everybody knows, there was a lack of real estate opportunities. I think that's clearly been addressed and being addressed. There's plenty of great space. There's plenty of interest from a capital perspective in investing in New York. I think it remains that there's, still an immature ecosystem with regard to seasoned entrepreneurs that have gone through company life cycles, generated returns for investors, and are basically people that investors coming out of Boston and other parts of the country trust. That's something that is just going to develop over time. There's no way to force it. But over the last 9 months in particular, things have seemed there's been a lot of energy in my perspective. There's just so many more events happening. There's so much going on that I think we're going to hopefully regain the momentum that I felt New York City ecosystem was generating in that sort of 2016, 17, 18, 19 era before things sort of slowed down from COVID. So very bullish on it.
It's been interesting. And you may have heard me say this before, but like I started a NewYorkBIO 5 years ago, right? And people were still sort of like, we don't have the space. And now I don't think that that's as much of a factor. I mean, there can always be a situation where you can't find the specific space that fits your needs, right? Like, so that aside, I don't think space is as much of a factor, but I do think it takes longer to build that sort of flywheel of C-suite talent that exits and does it again.
Exactly.
It's a natural sort of process.
Right.
What's the one thing that you would like to see happen in New York in the life sciences ecosystem in the next, say, 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see a major sort of success story from a homegrown company coming out of New York that basically people can point to and be like, this is how you would do it in New York. I mean, I frankly think some of the Orange Grove companies, a company like Epinovix spun out of Weill Cornell with great local investors as well as Orange Globe, including Alexandria and Eli Lilly, could be that type of a program. So I'm looking for that big success story we can point to and say, this is sort of like the canonical model for New York, and then rinse and repeat to a large extent.
We'll mark our calendars and we'll have you back on where we'll talk about the success of the New York exits in the future. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. The time flew by, and we will let everyone get back to their day, but we really appreciate your joining us.
Thank you, Jennifer. Great to be here.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good Tuesday.